Hello, and welcome to this Australia-New Zealand Women's Declaration International webinar for August 2025. I'm Janet Fraser, convener of the Feminist Legal Clinic in Exile. I'm coming to you from Gundugaranara, west of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay tribute to elders past and present, and especially the women of this continent. We have two speakers tonight. Jo Smith is a lesbian from the UK who has lived in Melbourne for almost 25 years. She has mostly worked in housing in various roles, from supporting tenants associations and developing housing cooperatives to frontline homeless services. She thinks housing is a human right. She's also done some work in health and the asylum community detention sector. Jo came out in 1982 and was involved in a lesbian and gay support organisation called London Friend for some years. The lesbian group was periodically approached by cross-dressing men wanting to attend, and they were given short shrift. London Friend still exists, but obviously the women's groups are no longer confined to biological women. Jo has sat on a few boards and panels, including being on the management collective of an independent organisation that supports women in prison. She got involved in this after learning the statistic that women are more likely to serve out a full sentence due to not having an address they can be paroled to. Overall, she is for decarceration, with some caveats about public safety and containment of very dangerous people, virtually all of them men. So I'd like to ask our first speaker to step up. Jo.
Hello, I'm Jo Smith. Janet's just read out my first paragraph for me, but maybe I'll just say it again. So I'm Jo Smith. I'm a lesbian and radical feminist from the UK, but I've now lived in Melbourne on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people for almost 25 years. And that came about because I was minding my own business in a pub in South London and I met an Australian who I've still got. And I've mostly worked in housing, so developing tenants associations and cooperatives, frontline homeless services, and I've had a bit of connection with the asylum and community detention sector. And there's an overlap between housing and homelessness and imprisonment, because without somewhere to live, the chances that you will get out of prison are reduced, the chances that you'll stay out of prison are reduced, and the chances of re-establishing your life in a meaningful and healthy way are massively damaged. So yeah, I came out as a lesbian in 1982 through London Friend, where I remained a volunteer for several years. And for the lesbian group on a Thursday evening with a phone line and drop-in, we had a steady trickle of male callers who would want to come along to the group and say things like, "I'll wear a skirt," to which you could only say, "Well, you'll be the only one who is," and it's still no. And my favourite entry in the book recording the calls read, "A man rang to tell me he was wearing a navy blue box-pleated skirt and beige stiletto slingbacks. Advised him stilettos will give you varicose veins and you need a very good figure to carry off box pleats." We never let them attend, and we never for a second thought they were female. And I don't think they thought they were female either, really. They just wanted their fetish endorsed. And the belief, and it is a belief obviously, that men who dress as women actually are women is much more recent, because this was 40 years ago. Spurious claims of historical precedents notwithstanding. And without it, we wouldn't be having to have a serious conversation about whether men, however they dress and whatever they want to be called, should be in prisons with women. And I'll just mention here that lesbians at London Friend also organised a lesbian self-defence class which ran for a few years and which passed into legend, and it was cited for years, decades afterwards as political correctness gone mad, after we got council funding from Islington and the Greater London Council, both famously left-wing at the time. And of course nowadays we would have to allow men to participate, or we would have until the recent court decision in the UK, so thank you Supreme Court. And while London Friend still exists, as Janet just mentioned, and it still has women's groups, they've expanded that to these new improved women that have got men in. So like the TQ plus endlessly being added to LGB, I keep seeing "and gender diverse people" or "and trans and gender diverse people" added to the word woman or women, which would have been perfectly adequate on its own for so many organisations and services. So my working life has mostly been in housing in a whole range of different roles, which include tenant participation, co-op development, asylum and refugee housing, tenant advocacy, frontline homeless services here and in the UK. Working in the UK tenants movement fostered a commitment to a bottom-up model. Tenants in council housing, which is the UK equivalent of public housing here, worked together in local groups and federations of groups to make decisions and influence policy affecting their communities and their rights. So it was a movement run by, for and about the people affected, like the campaign for women to have the right to vote, for women's rights to their own bank accounts and mortgages, protection from rape in marriage, and the long patient struggle of lesbians and gay men to achieve equality under the law in marriage, age of consent and inheritance rights. By, for and for the people it was about. So previous generations have lived through massive events and crises. My grandparents lived through the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. My parents lived through the Second World War. They were both 10 when it broke out and lived near London. So luckily they survived, or I wouldn't be sitting here. My generation lived through the AIDS epidemic and fought a government in the UK on the grossly unfair poll tax and Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which prohibited intentional promotion of homosexuality. I'm not sure why they added intentional, but maybe if you accidentally suggested it was okay, you had a defence. And there were mass demonstrations against nuclear weapons, racism and defence of communities affected by policies, like the Thatcher government's destruction of the mining industry. And history was made by the groups Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners and Lesbians Against Pit Closures. And the National Union of Mine Workers turned up to support Pride in 1985 and subsequently adopted lesbian and gay equality as official policy. And I'm proud to say I was there. My point is that these were real struggles to improve and in some cases save the lives of real people. When it comes to the gender movement, not so much. It seems we now have a generation throwing itself into the notion of trans rights without ever really explaining what that means. I imagine those belligerent clowns who mask up and turn up and try to drown out the sound of women's talking about their rights while carrying banners calling us fascists who should be killed. Now, I'm sure they see themselves as the vanguard of a liberation struggle. They're all Che Guevara in their head, which just feels like a complete luxury oppression, and it's reinforced by the establishment embrace of gender identity, which is very, very disappointing, obviously. And so on to prisons. I want to start by saying that I'm far from an expert on this issue, and I'm not currently involved in any work directly involving them, although I sometimes have conversations with justice workers looking for support with finding housing, both temporary and ongoing, so that women, largely women, can be paroled or bailed and not locked up unnecessarily. It's distressing how many people being held are actually being held on remand. They haven't even been convicted of anything, but are being kept locked up. So I've supported those agencies, and I spent some years on the management collective of an organisation supporting imprisoned and criminalised women, which, as Janet mentioned, that started when one of my colleagues, male colleague actually, overheard the shocking statistic that women are more likely to serve their sentence all the way to the end rather than be paroled. Generally, there's a point at which you become eligible for parole with any prison sentence. But you have to have somewhere to go. And men are more likely to have somewhere to go, a long-suffering mother or partner who can take them in and provide an address. So I met with them to discuss housing, especially co-ops, because that's a field I worked in at the time. And that didn't really go anywhere. And that's partly because, or largely because, the female prison population is pretty small. It's sort of 8% of the prison population is female. And women know each other, and they don't necessarily want to live in a cooperative setting with all the other women. Co-ops are independent units, but operating together to run their housing. And they're a great option for the right people. But people don't necessarily want to be in a co-op with other people that they know from D-Wing or any other prison. But so that didn't go far, but I ended up on this panel for this management collective for some years. And housing really is a big, big issue. So the information that I'm basing my comments on is all in the public domain. It's detailed statistics on prison populations, including ethnicity, most serious offences, etc. It's all available on the website of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So it may not be a view that enjoys widespread support, but I think prison is archaic, inhumane, expensive, and above all, ineffective. It costs taxpayers a fortune. It further alienates already marginalised people from reintegration into society, and it doesn't really work. Yes, it removes dangerous people from circulation, and there are certainly violent people, almost invariably male ones, who need to be contained. But prison doesn't reform people. The rate at which people are jailed again tells us that. And every time you're in prison, the chances that it'll happen again go up. And I think we're so used to the idea of prison that we tend not to stop and ask whether it is the best or only possible approach to maintaining a safe and civilised society. And I wish we could do better. And we know that prison, like women's sport, now that men keep muscling in, is far from a level playing field. Pun completely intended. Certain groups are massively overrepresented, especially Indigenous women and Vietnamese women here in Victoria, for reasons often linked to gambling and drugs, and overall women from deprived and impoverished backgrounds. Poverty, of course, is a major driver of all the things that lead women to being imprisoned, including incarceration for unpaid fines and penalties. How is that a good use of resources? Stats consistently show that imprisoned women are disproportionately victims of neglect, abuse, and family violence. Education and literacy levels are often very low, so it feels as if the scales have been weighted against them from childhood. It's certainly not because they're committing all the crimes. And women commit a tiny proportion of violent offences that would justify containment in secure facilities. So I am largely in support of the abolitionist view, and I think it's a discussion we need to have. That's obviously an aspirational stance rather than an immediately practical one. Locking more people up does not seem to reduce crime rates, any more than building more roads reduces traffic congestion. And we might like to claim that prison rehabilitates. If you're here in Victoria, you'll have seen the current advertising campaign spruiking jobs with corrections, inviting you to come and work in the prison system and help people get back into society. Yeah, but it doesn't do it effectively, and the primary function is punitive. And being locked up is a punishment, of course it is, but surely it should not be compounded for women by the additional fear of being housed alongside men. Now, I watched the seminar from May in which Eileen, whose surname I can't remember, talked about the efforts women have made around the world to push back on prisons placing men or male-bodied people in prison with them, with very limited success. And that's distressing and distressingly unsurprising too in the current environment. And I think that being imprisoned, especially for women, is like being disappeared. Your contact with the world is so constrained and controlled, so little information is available about what goes on. So they feel like black holes with light unable to enter or escape. And as we know, there have been multiple high-profile cases of dangerous and abusive men being placed in women's prisons on the basis of self-idea here and overseas. And it also appears that record keeping has been so slack that we cannot even get accurate figures. I found a completely casual reference online to the fact that male to female prisoners are almost invariably housed in the female estate, certainly in New South Wales. And it obviously does happen a fair bit here in Victoria. And I guess this goes with the whole refusal to acknowledge any material difference between women and trans-identified men. You'd think that the sudden surge in female sex offenders would give anyone pause for thought, but apparently not. So a number of services and advocacy groups work with women in prison in Victoria and of course elsewhere, and they're good committed people. But like so many other organisations and areas, prison-related advocacy for women has had, and trans and gender diverse people welded on to the completely adequate term woman, rendering it meaningless. So, give support to the trans and gender diverse, whatever that actually means, community, in or out of the criminal justice system, but not at the expense of women. And I just want to add that despite the frustration of seeing gender identity so relentlessly centred, I have no animus towards individual trans-identifying people. Adults can make their own choices. I may not believe humans can change sex. I may struggle to knowingly call someone by inaccurate pronouns. I may think J.K. Rowling is God, but I really want our focus to be on women and their safety and dignity. And prison already massively compromises both of those, and we should not be compounding it by pretending that male people can or should be incarcerated with female people. And that's what I've got to say.
Thank you, Jo. I appreciate your time and experience, and I know women will be keen to discuss further with you when we get to question time.